A bark in the dark, a crack of dry wood, a spark, small, almost invisible, rising from inside a barn. No one notices. No one screams yet. Within hours, that spark will swallow an entire city of more than 300,000 people. It will melt steel. It will turn glass into liquid running down walls. It will cross a river. A river. The water that should have stopped the fire from advancing will simply be leapt over, as if it weren't even there. By the time the rain finally puts out the last flames, 17,000 buildings will lie in ashes, more than 100,000 people will be homeless, and a scar more than 9 kilometers long will cut through the heart of the city. How did a fire that began in a wooden barn manage to destroy one of the most important cities in the United States in just over 24 hours? Why couldn't the country's best-trained firefighters stop it? Why did no one, among engineers, politicians, or residents, see the danger that had been building, brick by brick, year after year, right under their feet? And why, more than 150 years later, do the cities you know today, their laws, their buildings, their fire hydrants on the corners, still carry, without most people realizing it, the marks of that October night? This is not simply the story of a fire. It is the story of a city that believed it had mastered fire, and that had to lose everything to discover how wrong it was. What you're about to see is not only the fall of an American city in the 19th century. It is the quiet birth of nearly everything we understand today as fire safety. The building codes that ban certain materials, the standardized hydrants on the streets, the professional fire departments, organized and funded as an essential public service. The very idea that a skyscraper could exist with a steel structure instead of wood was born in large part from the ruins left behind that night. Before we go on, a quick pause. If you're enjoying learning how events that feel distant actually shape the world we live in today, it's worth subscribing to the channel. Stories like this arrive every week, and it would be great to know where in the world you're watching from. We've already seen comments from Brazil, Portugal, the United States, and places we never expected to have viewers. Now, back to Chicago. In 1871, Chicago wasn't just a big city. It was a city that seemed to be racing against time. 40 years earlier, that territory had been little more than a trading post beside Lake Michigan, surrounded by marshland. By 1871, it was the fastest-growing city in the United States, a railroad hub connecting the industrial East to the agricultural West, a trading center for grain, lumber, and livestock that moved fortunes every single day. The streets were wide, laid out hastily to accommodate growth no one could predict with any precision. Multi-story buildings rose beside the simple homes of laborers. Rail lines cut through entire neighborhoods. And underneath almost all of it, there was wood. A great deal of wood. The sidewalks were made of wood. Most of the streets were too. The rooftops, the facades, the warehouses along the river, packed with coal, resin, oil, and bales of hay. It's estimated that, at the time, more than 2/3 of the city's structures were built entirely or partly of wood, including buildings that from the outside appeared solid in stone or brick, but hid wooden frames behind thin decorative layers. Chicago looked modern, but it was in large part a city of stacked matchsticks, disguised as a metropolis of stone. On the weekend of October 8th, 1871, life went on like any other autumn Sunday. Families came home from church. Shopkeepers closed their stores early. Workers enjoyed the day off, resting after an intense week in the warehouses and factories. No one was thinking about fire that day, though anyone who paused to look closely would have found an uncomfortable detail buried in everyday conversation. It had barely rained in weeks. The summer of 1871 had been dry. The autumn, even drier. Only about a quarter of the normal rainfall had fallen between July and October that year. The grass had turned yellow. The wooden sidewalks, parched, creaked underfoot like dry twigs. And the wind, in that early October, blew hard from the southwest, shaking rooftops and stirring up dust in the streets. It was just wind. No one saw it as a warning. There was, however, something more dangerous than the drought moving through Chicago that autumn, and it wasn't in the sky or in the ground. It was in people's minds. The city believed, with an almost arrogant confidence, that it had already faced the worst fire could offer and survived. Chicago caught fire all the time. Records from the era show the city suffered, on average, about 2 fire incidents a day in 1870, most of them small, quickly brought under control by firefighters, almost routine. In the week before the Great Tragedy, about 20 separate fires were recorded across the city. One of them the night before had already been enormous. A fire at a lumber mill destroyed 4 entire blocks and left the city's fire department exhausted, with half its men off duty, equipment damaged, and hoses still wet and scattered across the streets. No one knew it yet, but the city was about to face its hardest trial with half its response force already spent. Add to that an alarm system that relied on watchmen in towers observing the city with the naked eye, on telegraph communication between posts, and on human decisions made under pressure, in the dark, with incomplete information. Add a city growing faster than its own ability to protect itself, built on wood and fed by dry winds sweeping in from the prairies. That was Chicago's invisible mistake, believing that experience with small fires had prepared it for the big one. In reality, it had only made the city more confident and less alert. At around 9 o'clock on the night of Sunday, October 8th, 1871, a fire begins in a small barn on the property of Patrick and Catherine O'Leary on DeCoven Street, on the city's southwest side. The exact cause was never determined with certainty. The most famous legend, that a cow belonging to the O'Leary family knocked over a lantern, became popular in the newspapers of the time, but the very reporters who spread it later admitted, decades afterward, that they had invented it to make the story sell better. The O'Leary family always denied any direct involvement, and no official investigation was ever able to prove the exact origin of the flame. Other theories, including a dropped pipe, a candle, or even fragments of a comet, were raised over the years, but none of them hold up under real evidence. What's known as the essential part. Around 9 p.m., the O'Leary's barn is on fire. And from that simple, almost trivial point, everything begins to spiral out of control. The watchman in the city's observation tower spots the smoke, but makes a calculation error, placing the fire's location more than a kilometer away from where it actually is. The first firefighters are sent to the wrong spot. Precious minutes. The minutes in which a fire can still be contained before it spreads, vanish while horse-drawn carriages head in the wrong direction through the city's dark streets. By the time the error is corrected, the fire has already leapt from the barn to the neighboring houses. And the wind, that dry, strong wind from the southwest that no one had taken seriously, begins its work. An ordinary fire spreads by contact from one wall to the next, from one roof to another. But that night, Chicago is about to witness something different. The strong wind, fed by the very heat of the combustion, begins spinning on itself, creating what witnesses would later describe as fire devils, small incandescent vortices that rise into the air and hurl embers and burning debris hundreds of meters away, far beyond the normal reach of flames. It's this phenomenon, today studied by scientists as a fire whirl, that explains one of the most frightening mysteries of that night: how the fire managed, again and again, to cross obstacles that should have stopped it, including a river. The Chicago River splits the city into 3 distinct divisions: south, north, and west. For any resident that autumn, the river was, in theory, a natural firebreak. Water separating one side from the other, a physical limit the fire shouldn't have been able to cross. But Chicago's river, in 1871, wasn't exactly clean water. Decades of industrial dumping had left its surface coated in oil, waste, and flammable debris. And the embers carried by the wind didn't need a clean river to cross it. All it took was a single spark landing on a wooden roof on the other side. That's exactly what happened. Shortly after midnight, the fire is no longer confined to the neighborhood where it began. It has crossed the water. It's now in the South Division, advancing straight toward the city's most valuable commercial district. Banks, hotels, newspapers, offices, practically all of Chicago's built wealth concentrated in a handful of blocks. Meanwhile, in the streets, something shifts in the collective mood. Up to that point, it was just another big fire, something worth curiosity, not fear. But as people begin to realize the fire is no longer contained to one neighborhood, that it's advancing swiftly, Fed by a wind that seems to grow stronger by the minute, curiosity turns into panic. Crowds pack the bridges. Carts loaded with furniture, clothing, family portraits, anything that could be saved in a hurry, compete for space in the narrow streets with people running on foot, many still in their night clothes. Terrified horses refuse to move toward the flames. At a certain point, the firefighters themselves, already exhausted from the fire the night before, working with damaged equipment, begin to realize they're facing something beyond anything they had ever seen. It's worth pausing here to understand something important. Chicago wasn't a city naive about fire. It had one of the most respected fire departments in the country, with modern equipment for the time, including steam-powered pumps. But the entire system had been designed to fight ordinary fires, a building, a block, maybe an entire street in extreme cases. No one had planned a response for a fire that behaved like a storm, one that created its own weather, generating winds capable of hurling fire hundreds of meters ahead of any firefighting line. What Chicago faced that early morning was no longer a traditional urban fire. It had become, in practice, something closer to a firestorm, a phenomenon in which the extreme heat generated by combustion creates its own local weather system, intensifying the winds and further feeding the flames in a self-reinforcing cycle. Around 2 in the morning on Monday, the fire reaches the central business district. Buildings their own builders had guaranteed were fireproof begin to fall, one after another. The deception comes to light. Many of these buildings had only a thin outer layer of resistant material, stone, cast iron, or metal panels, covering internal structures built entirely of wood. From the outside, they looked like fortresses. On the inside, they were firewood waiting for the right temperature. One of the most striking examples is the city's water pumping station on Pine Street, the facility responsible for supplying water to nearly all of Chicago. Its roof had been redone with slate, a material considered fire-resistant. But the structure beneath the slate was still pine wood. When a wind-carried ember reaches that roof, the fire finds its way into the building quickly. The pumping station collapses, and with it disappears the city's ability to deliver pressurized water to the very firefighters still trying to contain the blaze. From that moment on, Chicago has no way left to fight the fire with equal force. The hoses lose pressure. Water jets that once reached the tops of buildings can now barely wet the walls. The fire is no longer being fought. It's only being watched, with a mix of horror and helplessness. At this point, it's easy to lose sight of the fact that behind every statistic were real people, making split-second decisions under heat that account for the time described as capable of melting glass and softening metal from a distance. Whole families become separated in the crowded streets, trying to find each other again at meeting points chosen in a rush. Merchants run to try to save records, cash, merchandise. Many end up abandoning everything once they realize the real choice is between their belongings and their lives. Firefighters keep working even after realizing the battle is lost, trying at least to open escape corridors, directing crowds toward bridges and the shores of Lake Michigan. And there's a detail few documentaries mention. Many residents sought refuge inside Lake Michigan itself, wading in up to their waists or necks, staying there for hours, surrounded by smoke and the orange glow of the burning city behind them, tried to escape heat that made simply breathing the air near the flames nearly impossible. Through the entire early hours of Monday, the fire keeps advancing north, crossing the river again, this time toward the more residential part of the city, where entire neighborhoods of wooden houses, far more vulnerable than the stone and iron commercial buildings, practically vanish before the flames. The glow of the fire, according to account from travelers on boats on Lake Michigan, was visible for dozens of kilometers, turning the night into something that looked like a monstrous orange dawn, arriving hours too early. No one, not firefighters, not authorities, not residents, had any real control over what was happening. The city that had taken such pride in its modernity, its rail lines, its trade, its position as the nerve center of an expanding nation, was being erased block by block by something that had started as a flame small enough to fit inside a barn. Only on the morning of Tuesday, October 10th, Nearly 2 full days after the fire began, does luck finally turn? A light rain begins to fall over Chicago. It wasn't a heavy storm. Records describe a relatively weak rain. But after more than 30 hours of continuous fire, fed by a dry wind that had already consumed nearly everything in its path, even that light rain is enough to tip the balance. The fire loses strength. The flames, one by one, begin to die out, leaving behind a scene survivors would describe for decades as impossible to forget. Entire blocks reduced to blackened skeletons, stone walls still standing but hollow inside, like empty shells of a world that no longer existed. When the fire finally goes out completely, the scale of the destruction becomes visible for the first time. An area roughly 6 kilometers long and more than a kilometer wide had been consumed, more than 800 hectares within the city. More than 17,000 buildings had vanished. More than 100,000 people, about a third of Chicago's total population at the time, were left without homes. The death toll remains uncertain to this day. Estimates range between 200 and 300 people, a relatively low number given the scale of the material destruction, though historians believe it's likely underestimated, since the extreme heat may have completely incinerated many bodies, leaving no identifiable traces in the rubble. Only around 120 bodies were actually recovered and identified. Material losses were estimated at around $200 million of the era's money, a value equivalent to billions of dollars today, close to a third of the entire real estate value of the city. In the days that followed, Chicago lived through a brutal contrast. On one side, reports of looting and disorder led the mayor to declare martial law in the city, with United States Army troops under the command of General Philip Sheridan, keeping order while local authorities tried to reorganize basic services: water, food, shelter. On the other side, a wave of solidarity unlike anything seen before in American history. Donations arrived from nearly every state in the country and from several countries around the world, including England, France, and Germany. Rival cities, which had until recently competed economically with Chicago, sent money, clothing, supplies, and equipment. Within a few weeks, temporary shelters began rising over the ashes themselves, and the city that had seemed to stop existing started showing its first signs of rebuilding. While the rubble was still cooling, a question began forming among engineers, politicians, and ordinary citizens. How do we stop this from happening again? That simple question is the true turning point of this story, because it's from that question that the second part of this story is born, one often forgotten. Not the destruction, but the investigation and transformation that followed it. In the weeks after the fire, city authorities called for an investigation to try to understand exactly what had gone wrong and why the city had been unable to defend itself. The conclusions were uncomfortable, but clear. First, it became evident that the city's architecture was the main factor behind the fire's spread. Fireproof buildings that, in practice, were nothing more than wooden structures disguised behind thin outer layers. Second, the water supply system had proven dangerously centralized. The destruction of a single pumping station had been enough to leave the entire city without water pressure at the most critical moment of the firefight. Third, it became clear that the alarm system, dependent on human observation from towers, had failed at the most decisive moment, sending the first firefighters to the wrong location. And finally, an environmental factor no one had taken seriously. The combination of prolonged drought and strong winds sweeping in from the prairies had created almost perfect conditions for an uncontrollable conflagration, something that, decades later, fire scientists would come to study systematically under the name of extreme fire behavior. The Great Chicago Fire didn't only produce pain and reconstruction. It produced knowledge. Engineers and architects began completely rethinking urban building materials. The use of wood as a structural material in central and commercial areas became progressively restricted by law in Chicago and later in numerous other American cities. More importantly, the fire accelerated the development and adoption of metal structures, iron and later steel beams and frames, as an alternative to wood in tall buildings. It's precisely from this new generation of architects and engineers, working over the literal ruins of Chicago, that the so-called Chicago School of Architecture is born, responsible for innovations that would make possible, just a few years later, the construction of the world's first modern skyscrapers. Yes, the fire that nearly destroyed Chicago forever also helped, indirectly, turn it into the birthplace of the skyscraper. A month after the fire, Chicago elected a new mayor, Joseph Medill, whose campaign leaned heavily on one direct promise: to put in place far stricter building and fire prevention codes. He won, and he delivered. New laws began restricting the use of flammable materials in construction within the central urban limits. Fire departments in several American cities were reorganized with better funding, training, and equipment, and, above all, with revised protocol for handling large-scale fires rather than isolated incidents. Fire water supply systems stopped relying on a single centralized pumping point, incorporating redundancy instead. Multiple sources, multiple paths, so that the destruction of one single structure could no longer paralyze a city's entire response capacity. More broadly, the Chicago disaster, combined with other major urban fires of the era, helped drive, over the following decades, the national standardization of hydrants, hoses, and firefighting equipment across the United States, a process that, until then, had caused real problems. Neighboring departments in different cities often used incompatible connections, making cooperation during large-scale emergencies far harder. There's a little-known detail that makes this story even more striking. On the very same night Chicago began to burn, fires of even greater scale were devastating other parts of the American Midwest. The deadliest of all struck the small town of Peshtigo in the state of Wisconsin, where a firestorm, fed by the same dry, windy conditions, killed a number of people far greater than in Chicago, estimated by historians at more than 1,000 victims, making it, to this day, the deadliest wildfire in recorded United States history. And yet, it's the Chicago fire that remains etched in the world's collective memory. Why? Probably because Chicago was a large city, commercially connected to the rest of the country through railroads and telegraph lines, with newspapers and correspondents able to spread the news quickly across the continent. While Peshtigo, isolated, rural, with limited communication, had its tragedy largely overshadowed by the massive coverage given to its neighboring city. That difference alone reveals something important about how history gets recorded. The deadliest event isn't always the most remembered one. Often, it's the most visible one. In the years following the fire, Chicago went through one of the most intense periods of reconstruction ever seen in an American city. Investment pouring in from across the country, combined with the city's strategic position as a railroad and commercial hub, turned reconstruction into an opportunity, a painful one, but a real one, to rethink the city from the ground up. Streets were realigned, sewer and water supply systems were modernized, and a new generation of buildings, built on metal frames, began defining a new urban aesthetic, taller, sturdier, far more fire-resistant than anything the city had known before. Within a few decades, Chicago hadn't just recovered, it had become one of the world's leading centers of architectural innovation, a living laboratory of ideas that would go on to shape city building across nearly the entire planet throughout the 20th century. If you've ever walked into a tall commercial building, ever seen a red fire hydrant on a street corner, ever watched a firefighting crew trained specifically for large-scale structural fires, you've already had indirect contact with the legacy of the Great Chicago Fire. Modern fire safety building codes, present today in nearly every major city in the world, trace their roots directly back to lessons learned, painfully, in October 1871. The idea that metal structures could replace wood in tall buildings, allowing for vertical, dense cities capable of housing millions of people in a small footprint, was also born, in part, from this tragedy. In the scientific understanding of how fire behaves at large scale, how it can create its own winds, its own vortices, its own logic that's nearly impossible to predict, began being systematically studied precisely because of events like this one, feeding modern disciplines such as fire behavior science, essential today for predicting and fighting wildfires around the world. And this is exactly where Chicago's story stops belonging only to the past. Because the same conditions that made that October night so devastating, prolonged drought, strong winds, large amounts of flammable material packed into a small space, keep repeating themselves today on an even larger scale in regions facing increasingly intense wildfires around the world. The difference is that today there are far more sophisticated alarm systems, well-studied evacuation protocols, strict building codes, and specialized fire departments, tools that exist in large part because cities like Chicago paid an extremely high price for them to be created. Even so, extreme fire behavior, its ability to create its own storms, to leap over barriers meant to stop it, to spread faster than any human system can react, remains one of the greatest challenges faced by scientists, engineers, and emergency crews around the world, especially as climate change makes drought periods longer and more frequent in many regions of the planet. The Great Chicago Fire ended on the morning of October 10th, 1871, when a light rain finally put out the last flames over a city that no longer existed the way it had just 2 days before. But what it left behind never truly ended. It lives on in every building code that requires fire-resistant materials, in every standardized hydrant, in every steel-framed skyscraper rising over the skyline of nearly any major city today. Chicago learned, in the hardest way possible, that excessive confidence in one's own experience can be just as dangerous as total ignorance of a risk. The city believed it knew fire, and it was exactly that confidence that left it unprepared to truly know it. Today, more than 150 years later, engineers are still studying extreme fire behavior. Cities are still revising their building codes. And somewhere in the world, right now, someone is making a small decision about a building material, an alarm system, an emergency protocol that exists only because a spark in a Chicago barn taught humanity a lesson it never wanted to forget again. The question that remains, then, isn't only about what happened that October night. It's about what excessive confidences, what imaginary fireproof buildings we're still carrying today without realizing that perhaps they too are just what disguised as stone.